Good afternoon and welcome to another Sweet Thursday program. Our final Sweet Thursday of the season will be on June 30th. Today we are on Zoom webinar format, and unlike Zoom meeting, we cannot see or hear any of you. You can ask questions of our author at the end of the program by typing them into the Q&A function. And as always, any of our recorded programs can be accessed on our friend's YouTube channel. Sweet Thursday is the author series sponsored by the Friends of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center, which is the all-volunteer organization that sells gently used books to support the Lafayette Library. My name is Jeff Deaton, and I'm the coordinator of the program. Today's moderator is Ruth Thornburg. Our last Sweet Thursday of the season will be in person, COVID willing, in the Don Tatson Community Hall at the library on June 30th. Lee Kravitz will discuss his debut novel, The Last Confessions of Sylvia P., which reimagines a chapter in the life of Sylvia Plath, telling the story behind the creation of the bell jar. Our next Wonder of the World program will be a Zoom webinar on June 8th, when a docent will highlight the DeYoung Museum's Obama Portraits Tour, featuring art from the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. Note that this program will not be recorded. As I mentioned previously, you can get our recorded programs on our YouTube channel, and here is the web link. In order to learn about more of our library programming, you can sign up for our weekly AgLib emails, examples of which are shown here, and they describe upcoming events, including those hosted by the Foundation and the County Library. You can do this by going to the website llcf.org/subscribe and enter your name and email, and you'll get these emails every Saturday morning. For even more programming, you can go to the County Library and search events, and there are a variety of search features to find things by date or subject or library branch. The Friends Corner Bookshop sells inexpensive, gently used books that support a number of programs shown here and services at the Lafayette Library. The Friends Amazon store, selling higher value books, can be accessed via the Friends tab on the library website, shown here with the blue arrow. And once again, we thank all these institutions: the Friends of the Lafayette Library, the Lafayette Library staff, the Lafayette Library Foundation, and my Sweet Thursday committee members. Dave's book can be purchased at Arinda Books. And we even have social media and might even have some followers on Instagram and Facebook. So Ruth Thornburg will lead the discussion with our author today. Ruth has served for many years on the board of the Friends and is a member for as long as I have of the Sweet Thursday committee, which is 5 years and longer actually, and has been a regular moderator. So I will now take my leave, and Ruthie, it's time for you to come on.
Oh. Good evening. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. Got all the background stuff out of the way. Tonight, I have the pleasure of talking with Dave Zirin. His latest book is The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. So just a little bit about Dave. He is an American political sports writer, and I think that's kind of key. I mean, he really gets into the politics behind sports, and we're going to get a chance to talk a lot with him about that tonight. He's the sports editor for The Nation, which is a weekly progressive magazine dedicated to politics and culture. He also writes a blog named Edge of Sports. The Nation's sports editor, Dave, is also the author of 10 books on the politics of sports. And he's been considered a visionary who's changing our world. One of the people that really brings out the topics that need to be discussed. And I think you'll agree with that after listening to him tonight. He's been a frequent guest on ESPN, MSNBC, Democracy Now! He also hosts the Edge of Sports podcast, which I talked about. That's a weekly podcast. He has been on a lot of national radio, including NPR's Tell Me More, Talk of the Nation, and All Things Considered. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Vibe magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, The Source, and numerous other publications. Tonight, we're going to be talking with him about, as I said, his most recent book, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. With that, Dave, will you come on and join me, please? Hey.
Hello.
So I'd like to start tonight just by talking about the knee itself and what a symbol that is, and how Colin Kaepernick came to the decision to take that, not necessarily the decision, but let's talk about the symbolism of the knee itself, and then we'll get into the background of Colin and his decision and how he made those first steps.
That's a terrific question. I will say that in the sports world, taking a knee is a kind of a sacred act. It's what a coach does when he brings around or she brings around their players. And what the coach says when they're at a very serious moment is, okay, everybody, take a knee. That means the fun and games have stopped and it's time to take seriously what it is you're doing. Taking a knee is also a traditional symbol, particularly in the sports world, of prayer. People might remember over 10 years ago the sight of Tim Tebow, the quarterback, often taking a knee. No one said Tim Tebow was protesting police brutality when he took a knee, because he was very clear that this was a prayerful act. Although I bet he wouldn't take a knee today precisely because how the language around that knee has changed so dramatically, thanks to Colin Kaepernick. So that's the knee. Now, how it became Colin Kaepernick's knee is a very interesting question, because this did not evolve out of some year-long focus group studied plan to make a political impact in the world of sports. Actually, the first time Colin Kaepernick did not stand for the anthem, he didn't take a knee at all. This was in August of 2016. It was before a preseason game. And Colin Kaepernick quite spontaneously just sat on a bench behind his teammates during the anthem, largely because he was extremely frustrated with the absence of justice following two police killings that summer, one of a man named Alton Sterling in Louisiana and one of a man named Philando Castile in the Twin Cities. And like many people, there had been demonstrations all summer, and like many people, he was tired of being tired. And so he just sat during the anthem. And, there's a good chance we never would have known it had happened, except one reporter by the name of Steve Weish, who I think ironically works for the NFL Network. That's the network of the National Football League. But Steve Weish is a longtime reporter and very independent minded, and that wasn't going to stop him from making a beeline to Colin Kaepernick and saying to him and asking him the question like, hey, you're sitting. There have been a lot of protests this summer. Was that connected? And if Steve Weish hadn't asked that question, we wouldn't be talking right now. There wouldn't have been a book. There wouldn't have been a knee. There wouldn't have been anything. And so Colin Kaepernick said to Steve Weish, I was sitting because I couldn't live with a system where police get away with as he put it, their bodies in the streets and police are getting away with murder. It was too much. And after Colin Kaepernick said this, it was like the sports world, particularly my world of sports and politics, absolutely exploded. Became an issue in the Donald Trump-Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. Everybody had an opinion about it. And the Trumpian right wing in this story, they quickly made it as a disrespect to the troops themselves. They said Colin Kaepernick is disrespecting the military by not standing for the anthem. And Colin Kaepernick couldn't believe that because, he had military in his family, and he thought, the military was the furthest thing from his mind when sitting during the anthem. It wasn't even an echo of a thought. It was more because there's a tradition in this country, which we can also talk about, of people protesting during the anthem precisely to symbolize the gap between what this country promises and tragically far too often delivers. So that was Colin Kaepernick's state of mind, but he was very upset about the military criticism. So he went to a former NFL player named Nate Boyer, who was also a former Marine. And he asked Nate Boyer if he had any ideas for what he could do, because he still wanted to protest, but he didn't want to sit during the anthem and be accused of disrespect. And so Nate Boyer said, well, why don't you take a knee? Because taking a knee it's a prayerful gesture. It's what a person does traditionally when they propose to a prospective spouse. So it's got, the serious aspect. He talked about the way in sports, like I started this long answer about, this idea of taking a knee means it's serious business, but most of all, it's respectful. And so Colin Kaepernick said, yes, I'm going to take a knee. It's respectful, and that'll calm down the waters. And I think this is one of the great, miscalculations in the history of American protest, because they thought it would actually calm things down. But what it did instead was it raised the volume of the situation dramatically. And I think unbeknownst to him at the time, Colin Kaepernick gave a generation of young athletes a language by which they could also express their dissent simply by taking a knee during the anthem. And that's really the meat of my book, The Kaepernick Effect.
And really, you do a wonderful justice to the whole aspect of how the community then took up this call. And so I was fascinated with the many stories you've included in the book about local communities and local teams, all the way down into, the young youth leagues, really taking this to heart. And I think, one of the things that always has impressed me is the voice of the youth. They're so passionate and so sincere, and you really bring that out in your stories. And I think it'd be interesting for us to hear from you about some of those very passionate voices and the steps that they took in order to bring this message to their communities.
Absolutely. Well, I'll start by saying, before I get into the stories, how much I agree with you. I mean, when I started writing this book, it was really at the start of the pandemic. I was feeling very pessimistic about the state of this country, state of the world. Obviously, for anyone who's been awake this week, there is more reason to feel incredibly pessimistic or sad about the state of things. But talking to these young people for this book, I finished the book feeling actually optimistic, because I truly believe that this young generation just isn't going to settle for the things that other generations, my own included, were willing to settle for. They have too much urgency. They have too much passion. They are the generation that's the least tolerant of intolerance of any generation in the history of the United States. And I had the remarkable luck of them allowing me inside their world and their communities to tell these stories. And oddly enough, what was proved to be so helpful for me was the fact that the pandemic had just started and everybody was on lockdown, if we remember those awful days. And everybody was home and everybody was kind of bored. So what I was able to do was interview and really build relationships with people over the phone. It was very old fashioned. I mean, I don't know about other people out there, but I know when I try to text my 17-year-old daughter, she responds. But if I call her, she either doesn't answer or she answers and says, "What is it?" And I say, "I just was calling to ask you to pick up some groceries." And she'll say, "Well, don't call next time, text. I thought it was an emergency." See, a phone call is now an emergency. And
Funny how
so,
things elevate, yes.
Yes, it's elevated. If you're actually calling somebody on the phone, it's serious, and that's God. We're so atomized and separated from each other, despite all this technology to connect us.
It's very true.
Paradoxically, so, but it proved to be a godsend for the purposes of the book because people really did want to talk, particularly about a moment that invariably 100% of the people I spoke to, whether they were high school students, junior high school students, college students, professional athletes, they all were very proud of what they did, even if they faced a backlash for taking a knee at their local high school, college, or team, even if they had teammates that turned against them, even if they had violence threatened against them or their family, they all felt a real pride at having been a part of what they see correctly in my argument as an under-discussed national movement. I mean, people got to realize that you could go to any state in this country and also type in the words kneeling during national anthem, and you'll see stories come up. But none of them are linked together. But by my count, you had thousands of
Wow.
young athletes take a knee in the years after Colin Kaepernick did. It's just invariably there were these were stories in the local press, and it wasn't just football players. It was a lot of women athletes who took a knee. There were cheerleaders who took a knee. There were band members who took a knee. There were even singers of the national anthem who took a knee. And I think this is what we need to realize. Let me
Yeah,
just
I
check.
think it definitely um, comes through in your stories. One of the examples that you talked about was Garfield High School, and I was
Yes.
really impressed with that. Maybe you could go into give some information about that situation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Garfield High School in Seattle, for people who don't know it, is a very historic place. It's the high school of people like Quincy Jones and Jimi Hendrix. It's got an other just amazing alumni. Bruce Lee's wife went there. I always found that interesting. But so it is like the historic school in Seattle. And after Colin Kaepernick took a knee, there were a couple of people on their football team who said, maybe we should do that too, both in solidarity with Kaepernick, but also because of some local cases of police brutality in Seattle. And we could connect what Colin Kaepernick was doing with what we're dealing with here in Seattle. You see, that's the interesting part. People took the national message of what Kaepernick was trying to say and they localized it to the cases in their community. I mean, really ingenious kind of organizing because it always got attention. It always raised the temperature in the room. It always started discussion, some cases very positive discussion, some cases very negative. Now, at Garfield High School, this is a story that really does lean towards the negative, even though there is a lot that's inspiring in it. After these two players talked about taking a knee, their coach got wind of it and their coach he made it an entire team discussion where they all spoke together and everybody had a real back and forth about how they felt about taking a knee, and they decided unanimously that they would do so as a team. And it was very stirring. The photographs, the team is very multiracial, so it was white kids, black kids, brown kids, it's just everybody taking a knee together, and it was beautiful. But not everybody who read the news story in the Seattle Times thought it was a wonderful thing. The school became inundated with complaints that rose to the level of death threats. Their coach, the one who helped facilitate it being a team activity, he had his tires slashed and he was later pushed out of his job. But it also spread to other teams in the school, including the softball team. And I spoke to one of the softball players for the book as well. And I think what it paints is a picture of a school that actually became closer through the process of a united resistance to racism that was inspired through the athletic department and then into the bloodstream of the larger school. Now, I think that's pretty remarkable myself. And I'll tell you why I think so. Because I don't know about you, but I never would have thought that the athletes at my high school would be like the motor of change. If anything, they were more often than not the more conservative people on campus. During the great building campus occupation at Columbia University in 1968, the football team was actually recruited to build a sort of a picket line around the main building where the occupation was taking place to keep out groceries and communications from the outside. I mean, so that's more the political tradition of athletes. I mean, we speak often about, not being able to recognize the civil rights movement without Jackie Robinson, or the 60s without Muhammad Ali, or the women's liberation movement without Billie Jean King. I mean, we speak about these things, but the reality is that a lot of the political history of sports is very conservative, and sometimes it can become explicitly reactionary. But that whole idea has really been turned on its head over the last decade. And you've seen athletes take much more public roles in speaking out. Not to get afield of what we're talking about here, but I would like to mention, I was quoted today in an article in the Washington Post by Greg Sargent that had a very interesting theory that seeing people like Steve Kerr, the coach of the Warriors, and now teams like the New York Yankees putting out statements calling for gun control could actually have a very interesting effect on the debate in this country, where each side has sort of tuned the other side out. I mean, sports is really the closest thing we have in this country to a national language, and really, I consider sports and national tragedy to be the last remnants of a monoculture in the United States. I mean, we're no longer united around common music or common television shows, common movies. Our culture has been sliced and diced a million different ways, but where we still come together is through sports, through politics, and through tragedy.
That's very true. Sadly, very true. So listening to you talk about Garfield, I think one of the things that impresses me is the courage that these people have. But it's not only the courage. Do you think they were aware of the risk they were taking? And was that part of the calculation, or what's your opinion on that?
More often than not, completely not aware of the risk of taking a knee, although some were. And what I invariably found out in doing all these interviews, and I interviewed over 100 people for this, but what I invariably found out in interviewing the kneelers is that some of them did prepare and got teammates on board, and maybe even got a coach or two aboard. And the ones that prepared tended to have a much easier time afterwards because they already had allies. The ones who did it sort of like as the spur of the moment decision, or because they were very upset that day, which is true in a couple of the cases, they found out that their story was really just beginning once their knee hit the ground. And in a lot of ways, their knee hitting the ground was the least interesting part of what they were going to have to deal with. It's really, that's what really the book is about. I was thinking about this. It's really about the aftermath. Someone joked with me that the title of the book, that famous book about pregnancy, What to Expect When You're Expecting, that the book should have been called What to Expect When You're Protesting, because all the people deal with these different scenarios when they're protesting. And so it's almost like a how-to book at times. Like, what do you do if your coach doesn't side with you? How do you handle that? What do you do if your teammates stab you in the back? How do you handle that? What do you do if someone comes down from the stands and tries to accost you? How do you handle that? So I find it collectively to be very interesting, like how they navigate their specific situations, because it's so interesting, because they're all united, everybody in the book, by this shared belief that something needs to be done, really about racial inequity in the United States. Something needs to be done. And at the same time, the reactions to them saying this do vary. Like it makes a difference whether you say that in Oakland, California, or if you say that in a small town in Texas, or if you say that in a small city in upstate New York where people fly the Confederate flag. I mean, all of these different environments create different outcomes, even though their message was very much the same.
You mentioned Texas, and I think that's one of the other key stories in your book is what happened in Beaumont. I think that was shocking when I read about it. Could you talk about those details a little bit?
Absolutely. Talk about Beaumont. And I do apologize if my shirt blends with my background. Someone just put that up on the chat, and I feel terrible now. I did not even consider that my shirt looked like the background and I look like a floating head. So I apologize for that. Just go with it. Go
Yeah,
with it.
I agree.
Yeah. Beaumont, Texas. It's interesting. There's an expression in Texas that the big three are faith, family, and football, and not necessarily in that order. That's a very Texas saying. And in this case, though, you see that football doesn't matter as much to certain football officials in Texas when they're being confronted politically. See, in Beaumont, there was a team called the Beaumont Bulls, and this was a team of fifth and sixth graders, and they decided that they were going to take a knee as the Beaumont Bulls. And the response by the commissioner of the league where the Beaumont Bulls played was not to suspend them. That would seem to be terribly harsh to me, but maybe suspend them a game. It wasn't even to suspend the team for a season. They just shut down the whole league. They shut it down. They're like, if they're going to have people who kneel in this league, then we're not going to have a league. I mean, and what a terrible message to send those young people who felt like that they were just trying to do something to contribute to their community and start a conversation that they wanted to have. And the response to that was so ugly. But this is one story that really does have a happy ending because thanks to social media, this story actually became much more known than most of the stories I speak about in the book. And several NFL players donated money so they could start a new league. And this new league is built on principles of education, and they're holistic, and it's kind of like youth sports the way I always wanted youth sports to be. So it's a very nice ending of the story in Beaumont, Texas, and with the Beaumont Bulls. And I was able to interview the mother of one of the Beaumont Bulls, and that was an experience unto itself because people are the best storytellers. When they speak about their own stories. I've just found that to be the case, is that we all have a great storyteller inside of us. And, and I found this in speaking to people like April Hankerson, the mother of Jaden Hankerson, who was one of the players on the Beaumont Bulls. It was really, it was really remarkable because I don't live in Beaumont, Texas. I don't know what it's like to be raising a Black child in Beaumont, Texas. And what's that even like? And she and others really went through with me, like not just saying the story of what they did, but saying the story of their lives and how it led up to this moment and prepared them or didn't prepare them for the backlash that would follow.
I mean, it's very surprising how such a peaceful protest of just leaning on your knee, so much violence was created as a result of that. And to me, that, I don't know, it's kind of shocking how that came about.
It is shocking. I also think that if the media and if reporters had seen this for the national story that it was when all these people were taking a knee and had written about it in a more national, holistic way, and it wasn't just these stories in local media outlets, I think we would have gotten a much better sense of the recent backlash that we've seen around critical race theory, the effort to remove books from libraries, the effort to remove books now from bookstores. I mean, you see all of this in the reaction to these kids who are taking a knee. You see this level of anger and resentment. Now, what's the source of this anger and resentment? I mean, one thing is that, people don't like to be challenged about their beliefs sometimes. Like if you are a white family and you think the police are just, and someone is saying, well, in my experience, that's not the case, you can either listen to that, try to hear it, or you could respond by putting up walls. And in some of the stories in the book, people do try to listen and try to find common ground. But in other stories, the opposite is the case, and you get this kind of violent reaction that is really troubling, but I think is of a piece with this country. We don't have to look much further than the recent week. I mean, there's such a culture of violence that sometimes that's people's gut response to feeling challenged politically. I mean, even by a peaceful, nonviolent protest. I mean, there's part of this country that really never wanted Colin Kaepernick to work again, that wanted him to have to leave the United States. And so there's this tension between, saying that there's this history of civil disobedience and struggle in the United States that we revere and we celebrate Dr. King's birthday and all this. But when people try to take those lessons and put them in the present tense, they tend to be excoriated, not unlike Dr. King was in his time.
What do you think the role of social media has been, could have been in Colin Kaepernick's case? I mean, it seems like there was such a movement after the George Floyd, and the entire country seemed to come out for that. And I just wonder, how those two situations compare. It seems
Yeah.
like.
Well, that was one thing. First, very quickly about that. I mean, we forget sometimes that the summer of 2020, after the police murder of George Floyd, saw the largest protests in the history of the United States. And I think we need to say that more, so people really understand what we lived through 2 years ago. There were protests in all 50 states in the United States. There were walkouts at countless schools, countless workplaces, countless cities shut down. I mean, this is like no other spasm of protests in the history of the United States in that summer of 2020. And when it happened, I called my book publisher and I said, you got to stop the presses on this book. This is too significant. And they agreed with me. I don't want to make it seem like they were resistant to this idea. But before they published, I went back to the phone, called everybody, and everybody I spoke to was either out in the streets or organizing people to go out in the streets. And that really made me realize for the first time the importance of this movement that took place. I mean, I at first was only writing about it because I didn't want it to be forgotten by history and have people just remember that Colin Kaepernick did it and nobody else took a knee. But what I realized after calling people was that while many roads may have led this country to the summer of 2020, one of them runs through the playing fields of the United States. I mean, there's a real bridge effect between what Kaepernick did and those protests in 2020. And, this is seen in terms of who organized and who was there. It was also seen in a lot of the protest art at the protests themselves, because, Colin Kaepernick, of course, took a knee, as we've discussed, and that's also how George Floyd was killed. And so for a lot of people, putting his knee on the neck, of course, of George Floyd, Derek Chauvin. And so what a lot of people did was they had signs that juxtaposed Kaepernick's peaceful knee and the knee that killed George Floyd and put those side by side. At George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, there's a lot of mural art and things of that nature. I was there recently. There's a big mural of Colin Kaepernick that's a part of it. So people seeing that connection between Kaepernick and what happened to George Floyd isn't something that, I came up with in my house here outside of Washington, D.C. I mean, this was something that people felt very close to their hearts when they were in the streets in the summer of 2020. Now, you asked about social media, and social media has been I think, a game changer for a lot of these struggles and protests, because in years past, particularly since the 1980s, you would have the occasional political athlete, and they tended to be criticized by the media and really hectored until they shut up. Shut up and play. But this is something different. Because of social media, it allows for players who protest to get an immediate level of support that, other media organizations, old media, if you will, they see that. And they have to respond to the fact that this player is actually inspiring people, not only dredging up derision or death threats or whatever, but like actually social media plays this positive role of amplifying a message and allowing a message to spread like wildfire. So yeah, that's the big picture as far as social media. It's been a game changer in the world of sports and protests. In the early 90s, there was a basketball player named Olden Polynice who was from Haiti. And at the time, Bill Clinton had gone back on a campaign promise to allow HIV positive Haitian refugees to be able to come into the United States. And when he backed off that promise, Olden Polynice in protest went on a hunger strike during the NBA season, which is an incredible thing to do. And he was destroyed for it by the media, and he quickly gave it up because he was just getting a terrible backlash. I think if an Olden Polynice did that today, they would immediately have 1,000 people say, "You go, don't eat, hold out," and other people wouldn't eat along with them in solidarity. I mean, social media allows for that kind of, it's almost like add water form movement. And for, it's that can also be a very thin gruel when you just add something to hot water, and like maybe it doesn't have staying power, maybe it doesn't have legs, maybe it doesn't have a base, but what it does allow for is this wildfire wicked spread of ideas, which allowed Colin Kaepernick to have a reservoir of support even when so many people, including presidential candidates, were trying to tear him down. Now, social media also giveth and taketh away, though, because you also saw social media as a place where people who found out about these stories of people taking a knee were able to reach out, maybe from halfway across the world, maybe in some bot farm in wherever, we're sending threatening messages. And it's so easy to find people's personal information. And these are high school students, and they had no idea this was going to come. So there's an ugliness, of course, we all know an ugly side to social media, which was certainly weaponized during these protests as well. But, I guess that's why we've got the block button.
Yeah, that's right. So what about the owners in the NFL? What do
Hmm.
you see? What was their role in all of this and the reaction to it?
Well, it's so interesting because, as people might be aware, Colin Kaepernick is now getting a legitimate shot with an NFL team, the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, one of the reasons I think that's happening is because the owner of the Las Vegas Raiders is Mark Davis. He's the son of a man named Al Davis. These guys were always the outlaws of the NFL. And so the very stuffy, if people saw the movie Caddyshack, the Davises are like Rodney Dangerfield, and the rest of the owners are members of the Bushwood Country Club. So just to give people a sense of why it's not surprising to me that the Raiders would be the ones to reach out to Colin Kaepernick after all these years. But it is also, I think, symbolic of the fact, though, that the NFL, which certainly colluded against Colin Kaepernick, after the season where he took a knee, no team would sign him. He's been out of the game for 5 years. Much lesser quarterbacks have been signed in the meantime, over sometimes to multiple teams. And now he's finally seeing his way back. And the only way to really make sense of that is also by understanding that the summer of 2020 really did change things, even if in some ways they just polarized them more. And the idea of keeping Kaepernick out, I mean, would be a scar that would be indelible on the history of the league. Like, wow, you prevented this guy from making a living because you disagreed with his
Right.
politics. And
In
his
spite of the
politics were about
talent.
and inspired people, and his politics are about racial equity. And this is a league that's 68% black. I mean, what do you have against racial equity? It raises a ton of questions for a league that has no blacks in position, no black people in position of ownership, but it does have, but it's utterly dependent upon black labor.
Yeah, you talk about racial contradiction in football, and this is pretty much what you're you're speaking of right now.
Yeah, that's the ultimate racial contradiction of football, is that there are very few opportunities for people of color in positions of managerial leadership, executive class, or ownership. I mean, it's like one of those, what do you call them? Not a sieve, a funnel,
Oh,
where
no.
it just gets more and more narrow in terms of what the opportunities are, the higher up you go. So I guess it's a reverse funnel, if there is such a thing. So the contradiction is that they're also utterly dependent on not just black labor, but black labor that doesn't rock the boat. You know, because football is incredibly autocratic, very top down. It demands a certain fealty of the players. And it's a little hard to do that if the players also feel like they're in a racist organization, a racist league. Like, if that's the perception among players, and I can tell you it is the perception of a lot of players, that makes it a lot easier to have the labor discipline necessary to even play the game of football. Football is not a sport for freestyling. Football is not a sport where you can do your own thing. Football is very much, let me put it this way. A boxer was once asked by his son, "Dad, should I play football or box?" And his father said, "Son, play football because nobody plays boxing." It's also true, though, I think, that nobody really plays football because of the level of injury, because of brain damage, because of all these issues. And so I think it's become untenable for them to keep Kaepernick out. And if he's good enough to play, I think there's a very good chance the Raiders will sign him. And that's a long way of answering your question. I'm sorry.
No, I'm really appreciating it. So there are some, I have lots of questions. I could keep talking with you all evening. I think you're very engaging on this subject, but there's a couple of things I see over in the chat that are also in my question. And one of them is regarding some of the other emblems of sports politics and people who stood out as making a protest. And I know you've written about the Mexico City Olympics and
Yeah.
Muhammad Ali. It seems, they're very significant people in this situation, this role. So maybe you could talk a little bit
Absolutely.
about that.
And I wrote a book called A People's History of Sports in the United States that goes through all of that history. And I reference it in the introduction of the book for sure. But I could tell you, as someone who's written about 68 and Ali and Billie Jean King and many other books, it was very important to me to give these kneelers their own book and their own chapter in that story. And so it's less of a compare and contrast with people like John Carlos and Tommy Smith. And by the way, John Carlos is like family to me. I did his book with him, like his memoir we wrote together. It's called The Sports Moment That Changed the World, if you want to check that out.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, but it's like, and I interviewed John Carlos for the book. Like, the book actually ends with words from John Carlos about the whole perspective. And yeah. So Carlos does get the last word in the book, or Dr. John, as I call him, does get the last word in the book. But the book is really for this young generation that's stepping out into the spotlight.
That's incredible. Okay. Let's just because it looks like we have a lot of people who are interested in talking to you. How about, we had one comment that wanted a little bit more information about Colin, and you've mentioned that he's got this opportunity with the Raiders. What do you think the likelihood is that he'll get that chance?
I think he's in a situation where the likelihood is very strong. And I want to be clear too, because I see this question in the chat. Like, I'm not lionizing the Davis family. I know Al Davis did the Bay Area very wrong on multiple occasions, and they're doing now to the city of Las Vegas what they did to Oakland. I mean, they're living on public welfare while schools and communities starve. So this isn't to praise the Davises. It's just to speak the truth that they are a bit of an outlier in terms of the fraternity of NFL ownership, which can give them more space to sign a Kaepernick, which will immediately become, a Kaepernick Raiders jersey will immediately become the best-selling jersey at the NFL store. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, this is about money without question. It's also about the fact that the Raiders have been embroiled in a lot of scandal over the last year on several points related to race and gender. And, signing a Colin Kaepernick is sort of like will be like for a lot of people, dipping the team in Lourdes. And all of a sudden they'll be forgiven of all the sins of the last year. So I just wanted to make that point clear about the
Yeah.
Bay Area and Davis. And I totally get it.
Yeah, well, we're 49er fans too, and so Colin played a big role in that. And, just learning about him when he was first playing, his story, it just, I hated personally to see the situation with him and over the whole taking the knee. I felt like
Hey, I wanted to ask a question about this blackballing issue because, it's been debated extensively. So David, why don't you tell us, because you're much more intimate with it rather than people conjecturing, but some people on the other side say it's not a blackball, it's just that he's not good enough.
Yeah, I hear that as well. It just doesn't hold water. In Colin Kaepernick's last season, he played 12 games for just a terrible 49ers team. His receivers led the NFL in drops, but still he had 16 touchdowns, only 4 interceptions, second lowest interception rate in the NFL that year, and he led all the entire NFL actually in yards per carry that last year. Um, Sorry, get
Well,
distracted.
it's, there's different systems, with 32 or whatever number of teams in the NFL now, you would, counter that argument would be not to yours, but that there's got to be some system that can accommodate a running quarterback that doesn't have a super strong arm. And so the fact that nobody's interviewed him other than Seattle and now the Raiders.
Yeah, the Seattle one wasn't even a real interview. I mean, the the issue more than anything is that the people should know so he had the skills, he had the ability to play somewhere. And so many more terrible quarterbacks have been signed in the meantime. But the other flip side to that is that they settled out of court with him. I mean, he was taking them to court on collusion charges, and they effectively paid him to stop the lawsuit. And I always, I mean, he had to do what he had to do. I'm not going to criticize Colin Kaepernick for making that decision. But I think one of the reasons why the NFL is desperate for it not to go to court was because then you have discovery, you have emails, and there's apparently this treasure trove of emails that the NFL has, and they released a couple of racist emails and incredibly misogynistic emails by former Raiders coach John Gruden, as partly a way to embarrass him to leave the NFL. But you have to think that if they have thousands of emails between NFL owners, that there's something in there about Kaepernick. I mean, given the way that they speak to each other from the emails that we've seen, it's very casual, it's very clubby. People tell racist jokes, all this stuff that you imagine would be said over the 17th tee. They're saying to each other like fools, frankly. They're saying this to each other over email. Where they're leaving their fingerprints all over their comments. And you have to think, I mean, it beggars belief to think they didn't have more than a few conversations about Colin Kaepernick.
I have a question about how are the owners, because you talked about the NFL owners, how are the owners of the WNBA different? And I speak of total ignorance. I don't know anything about them, but they've been much more embracing, it seems, of the actions of those athletes.
Yeah, the WNBA has, in recent years, consciously decided to do something that was very daring, and it's proven to be very successful. And that's lead with the actuality of who their players are rather than who they wish their players to be. So instead of finding like the three most photogenic players, which is what they did early in the WNBA's years, putting them in a ton of makeup and putting them out there, as a way to, have this kind of very heteronormative appeal, they've instead said, you know what? we actually have something even better than someone being telegenic. We have athletes who care about the world, and we're going to lead with that, and we're going to promote that. And they actively recruited people to buy into ownership of clubs who are politically active as well. And and that's very significant. And when there was, of course, a WNBA franchise owner named Kelly Loeffler, who was senator from the state of Georgia, and when she ran against Raphael Warnock, who of course beat her and tipped the entire power of the U.S. Senate, she was able to do so. The reason the WNBA, I'm sorry, was able to do so precisely and weigh in so hard on for Raphael Warnock, that they eventually actually even pushed Kelly Loeffler out of the league itself. And after she had spent a lot of time demonizing her own players for their participation in these movements, which is a remarkable story in and of itself. But so it's just like the WNBA has always taken on this mantle of, or not always, I'm sorry, in recent years, taken on this mantle of being committed to principles of social justice, to being LGBTQ friendly, to standing foursquare against racism. And it's made a big difference. And now their mettle is being tested once again, because of Brittany Griner's detention in Russia, one of their star players. And I've been writing about that a great deal recently. The WNBA recently signaled to their players that they could be public and open about pressuring the United States to do whatever means necessary they have to do to bring Brittany Griner home. And that's a change in strategy, where before they were being silent on the advice of the State Department. So very, very glad to see that shift, and it's going to be a heck of a test for the WNBA to see if they can. It's one thing to agitate a senator to victory. It's another thing to agitate a president to shift his foreign policy during a time of insane diplomatic tensions with Russia, and be able to pull in Brittany Griner and bring her home safely.
Hope that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
By all means necessary, let's bring Brittany home. I mean, she's facing 10 years behind bars, 5 years at hard labor for the alleged crime, and everybody should say the word alleged, even though I don't even think it should be a crime, of her having vape cartridges in her bag at the Moscow airport.
Wow.
Bargaining chip.
Yeah, so we have a lot of people I've got some messages here. Thank you for writing the book. I intend to go out and buy it today. Please go to Rent a Books. That's our little local retailer here. And I know, Dave, you're a big supporter of the local independent bookstore. So
Huge deal.
yeah.
I mean, because I'm fortunate to do what I do for a living, and there's no way I get to do it without independent bookstores. So I tell everybody, if you're going to buy a book, do it from bookshop.org, because they get all their stock from the indies, or support your local independent bookstore.
Yeah, we partner with our local guy here, and it works out really well. You just made another little note. Baseball players took a knee, specifically players on the Oakland A's. So I guess there wasn't a lot in the baseball arena, but.
So I'm just excited by that question, because there's a part of the book that's with Bruce Maxwell, who is the catcher of the A's, who did take a knee. And I talked with Bruce at great length, and he has a wild story and an incredibly interesting history. And people, one thing about the book is that you don't have to read it chronological. I mean, what's the word? You don't have to read it from front to back. You can skip around to the different stories, although I think it does read better from beginning to end. But if you want to skip right to Bruce Maxwell's story, I won't be sorry, because it's a whiz popper.
Yeah. Well, it just goes to show the Bay Area is we've got some good roots here in terms of supporting these kinds of things.
I love the Bay Area.
Yeah, we love
I'm
it.
not just saying it.
I haven't heard much from Harry Edwards lately. Do you communicate with him?
Harry, you haven't heard from him because he's got something up his sleeve that will make a lot of people smile. I'm just going to take a sip of this before I tell you. Sorry. Dr. Harry Edwards is executive producing a 12 episode series for Showtime, and its working title, I believe, is Asking Dr. E, but I'm not sure. But it's basically his life's work over the
Oh, that's
course of a
awesome.
ton of episodes. I mean, they are putting a lot into this. I was interviewed for it, so I got a sort of inside look at the production process. And I mean, this is going to be a worthy testament to Dr. Harry Edwards, and that is saying something, because one might think that there's no such thing, given all he has done, all he has written, and all he has given to this space where sports and politics come together.
Well, cool. I look forward to that. You have any idea the release, the drop?
Only that the first idea was that it would be out by the end of 2022. Now I'm hearing the beginning of 2023. They have a lot in the can, though. I think I don't envy the editors. Let me just say that.
Wow.
Do you have
Okay.
anything else you're working on, Dave?
Yeah, but I want to hold it very
Okay.
close to the vest until I get a contract signed. I'm really excited about a proposal that I wrote, but I'm worried about jinxing it.
Don't do it.
So
Yeah.
I'll tell you this, my Twitter is at Edge of Sports if people want to follow it, and I promise I will put out what the new book is the second I can. And if it gets rejected by everywhere, I'll put it out there anyway, because maybe someone else could do it better.
Okay. That's fair enough. Do we have any other questions out here? Looks like we got through them.
I think we got to them all.
Well, this is great.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the terrific questions, Ruth.
Oh, you're
Thank you
welcome.
so much, Jeffrey. This was a blast. I look forward to perhaps being able to come out there in person in the future.
Let's
That'd be great.
consider
With
that.
your,
I mean, it would be really fun to have you here at our local library. We've got a beautiful spot, and people would, I'm sure, be very, very happy to be able to see you there.
I would be thrilled. I love the Bay Area. As long as I think the way Jeffrey put it was a COVID willing.
Yes, COVID.
exactly.
We'll
Exactly.
do it.
Well, listen, take care of
Okay.
your family, and I hope everybody's good and healthy soon, and
Yep.
really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Be well.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.